We'll go ahead and give everybody one more minute to join and then go ahead and get started. We've got most everybody here. Denise, do you want to give people a couple more minutes? Like to get going. I had you muted, Denise, if you answered.
Okay, I didn't answer yet because I knew I was muted. I don't see the vendors on that were invited. I'd like to kind of get a roll call. Is Provide on for Region 2? Okay, is David Boston on?
Yes, I am.
Okay. I see Jim Dixon.
Yes, I'm with NetSmart.
Are there any other vendors that I didn't mention that are on the call today? Okay, thank you all for joining us today. Shelby with FEI, she's our project manager. She'll be doing the kickoff for the presentation, and Ryan, who helped us with the very detailed analysis of CDR to a WITS data warehouse. It took us about 3 months to define the requirements and get things started, and we're at a point now to give you guys some information, documentation, and to help you with this venture into WITS. So I'll turn it over now. I'm not sure if it's Shelby or Ryan that's doing the kickoff, but I'll turn it over to FEI.
Awesome. Thanks, Denise. All right, Ryan, if you want to move to the next slide.
Yep.
All right, so before we get started, there are a few ground rules we want to go over. I have gone ahead and muted everybody so that we can eliminate background noise. If you do have questions during the presentation, there should be a chat option on Zoom, and so if you want to click that and fill in your chat question, we will be monitoring that throughout the presentation, and there will also be a Q&A at the end if you can't figure out quite how to type out your question and would rather say it. And just for everybody's information, this is being recorded so that you can view it later, and anybody who has not been able to attend can view it as well. Go ahead. So our agenda for today, we'll do some introductions and recap from our meeting that took place in November. we are going to go over the new data model and submission guide overview. We'll also do an overview of the data warehouse portal screens. We'll talk about our rollout plan timeline, next steps, and then, like I said a minute ago, we will have a Q&A at the end. Go ahead.
All right.
So for our team on the DMH side, you guys all heard from Denise. And on their team as well, there is CG Dixon, who is serving as the help desk coordinator, and also Bobby Keene, their onboarding coordinator. From FEI, our product manager is Jessica Knott. The account manager for the state of Mississippi is Kate O'Brien. Denise introduced me. I'm Shelby Maloney, and I'm the project manager for this project. We also have a couple business analysts. We've got Sabi Sani and Ryan White, our FEI onboarding coordinator, James Brockman, and then lead developer, Andrew Barden. I got one chat message that said they could barely hear me. Is everybody having issues? Oh, I guess I muted it. Okay. We've got a couple more that say sounds fine and up and down. I'll try and talk a little louder. And if you want
Yeah. Hey, Shelby, it's Kate. It sounds like you're just in and out a little bit sometimes, but your volume is pretty good.
Okay. So to recap from our last meeting in November, the purpose of us doing the data warehouse is so that DMH can report on TEDS data, and that is a required data set for substance use disorder and mental health, and that's a federal requirement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And so the data warehouse is going to collect data from your EHRs and then also WITS, which is the FEI EHR. We'll put it on a central location so that DMH can accurately do. The data warehouse is replacing the current CDR, and so implementing this will minimize potential double data entry on y'all's side so that you don't have to enter into WITS and your own EHR. All right, you can go ahead.
Okay.
So here's a picture for our visual learners. You can see we've got the WITS EHR and then non-WITS EHRs over on the left side. All of those will be what we call submitting entities into the data warehouse. And from the data warehouse, which will store all that data, DMH will be able to do their TEDS report and then any other ad hoc reports that they find necessary. Okay, you can go ahead.
Okay.
Okay, so here are the we have a new XML file format instead of CSV. This is another one that we went over in November, so it is a repeat information, but just to reiterate, there will be 3 files that you will be submitting to the data warehouse. One will be a client level data set, one will be a treatment episode data set, and that's combining the DDR4, the D, A, and I files. And lastly, there will be the service event data set, and that is replacing the CDRS file. You may be working on the 837P claims as well, getting your systems ready to generate that file. And so the service event will be part of that 837 as well. In the data warehouse, we have improved error handling and messaging. Submission guides for each data set, as well as an introduction and an appendix, providing you with update acceptable field values and descriptions. And like I said earlier, there will be a portal where you can do the direct upload of data sets and also see error reporting in there.
Ready?
Yep. Right. Okay. So this is going to be a pretty brief overview just to give you an idea of some of the more in-depth trainings that are coming. Starting February 12th, we will have bi-weekly meetings with you guys, the providers and vendors, to go over the submission guides and provide any technical assistance. But in a minute, Ryan is going to go over the new data model. He's also going to introduce the submission guides, which include dataset highlights, rule and validation examples. He'll introduce the vocabulary that I just told you we would be providing, and then also go through XML file examples. Ryan, if you want to take it away.
All right. Thanks, Shelby. Hi, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. Please put something in the chat if you can't. My name is Ryan White with FEI. So yeah, as Shelby said, I'll be kind of introducing the submission guide, most of which you guys have seen already. There is a new introduction sort of document and an appendix, as Shelby mentioned, so I want to walk through that a little bit. We're probably going to spend you're going to have to listen to me for about 20 minutes or so. You know, there's a lot of pages in those documents, and my intention is not to read them to you, but I wanted to kind of give a tour of them and sort of show how they fit together, allow you to kind of think through some of your questions as you're seeing me talk. If you want to write those down, then we can come back and try to answer some of them today. And the ones we can't get to, the more technical ones, we'll want to save them for the future meeting, which I think is next week. So this is not intended to be sort of a everything call. It's more your introduction and overview to some of these concepts. But feel free to jump in if you do have some high-level questions. I realize there's a varied audience. We have some vendors and some providers, and executives. So this will be a little bit for everybody, hopefully. So with that, where I'm going to start is in this new document that we talked about. So DMH will be publishing a series of files, one for each data set, and then in addition, this introduction file. So I'm going to start here with section 4 and talk for a minute about what a pretty important concept about the different data sets and the way that they fit together. So essentially there's 4 to talk about. The first one, you as the providers really don't have to worry about. So DMH has already actually set up all of the provider records, as we mentioned on the first call, inside WITS itself. And what's going to happen is, on a periodic, on a basis, I think about once a day, that information is essentially synchronized to the warehouse. So all the provider information actually comes from WITS. So nothing to do there other than the only thing you'll have to be aware of really is your internal ID that actually starts in WITS and gets pushed to the data warehouse that all of your client data will have to reference. So it'll be a one-time thing at the beginning, get the providers over, and then a periodic thing to handle the, any updates that DMH makes, or if sites are added, that kind of thing. But for connecting your clients, the only dependency is let's make sure DMH, runs that extract the first time, and then you'll be ready to test. So that leads me to the second data set, which is a record of each individual, patient, or otherwise known as client. So there's a relatively small data set for client demographic information. And as I said, it's dependent on the provider information. The bulk of the data, I would say, is in the treatment episode data set, which does go to TEDS and also gives DMH a way to report on, statewide what they need to report on to answer questions they need to answer. So that's where we'll spend a little bit of time. That's where most of the elements are. But as far as dependencies, that's also required or dependent on provider, but really it's more directly dependent on clients. You don't send an episode unless you send the clients, right? Lastly, the service events we'll talk about briefly, and they are dependent on the treatment episode. And as this paragraph will say, when you get a chance to read it, I suggest you do read it. It does say that if you are uploading multiple files, let's say once a month or whatever, or once a day, whatever you decide to do, I think it's at least once a month according to the state policies. If you upload a file of each type, the system will handle that. It'll handle the correct dependency order. What we can't protect against is if you if you click the service file before you click the client file. So it's safest actually to upload them all at the same time. So that's talked about in here. There's some other general concepts in here that you'll want to read through. That's the main thing. There's a little bit about the XML naming and that kind of stuff. I'm not going to read that today. Some of it you guys will talk more about with some of the technical team later, as far as things like, do I send all my data? Do I just send updates? So that's kind of talked about here. The one thing I did want to point out on this kind of overview is this section about how the documents are structured, which you've seen already, but more specifically, a couple of different types of errors, which you may have seen as well. But just to call it out, we will be using XML, and we'll talk about that a little bit, and the reasons why, some of the advantages. But one of the advantages of the XML is that it can be validated kind of as a high-level structure, as opposed to a text file. That functionality is not built in. You'd have to build that yourself. XML gives a way to do that natively. So we suggest you guys actually check your files for schema validation errors first, and your vendors will know what that is. So if you're scratching your head, don't worry about it. So there's there's an interface between the systems. The XSD defines that. So that's one level of rule. There are also rules, simple rules on fields, as easy as this field is required, right? Maybe a little bit more complicated. This field must be, one of these values, or this field, has to be greater than a certain value. So I would call those field level rules. In addition, we have you'll see some rules that sort of cross fields, or even cross levels or entities. So, if you're a substance use client, then you have to give me drug information or substance information, right? That data is not in the field, right? It's in different levels. So you'll see rules structured around that. There's some sort of technical ones that I was getting at with the dependencies. You're trying to send me a client for a provider and you're using the wrong ID, or maybe a treatment episode for a client, you're using the wrong ID. So you're going to get a linkage error, all right? In general, I'll say, well, sorry, that leads me to the last group, which is we call errors, warnings, and guidance. These are more the business rules. Beyond the technical things, what are the things that DMH wants to prevent or wants to make sure are right so that they can feel good about their reporting, right? They want to have confidence in the system. You want to have confidence what you sent. So there's a pretty robust engine for rules in the system. And if you've read the submission guides already, you'll see examples of where you'll see the rule name. We're going to look at a couple, and you'll actually see the rule message right in the document. So when you get the message, you'll know exactly, you'll be able to literally copy paste it and search in the document to see what's leading to that if it's not clear enough. But errors are enforced so your records don't get in. If something is an error, then it'll show up on a report that we can talk about later. If you fix it, we keep track of the sort of key information about that record, and the next subsequent upload will actually correct it and kind of take it off of the bad list. So those are errors. Warnings are similar, actually. They function just the same, except they don't stop you. They have a message, they have a name, they point out DMH's preferences for data collection, but we don't stop you. And then you'll see a few notes. These are just notes throughout the document. There's a few other things in the intro that you'll want to read through, and I'll come back and reference a little bit of it, but you'll definitely want to reference or give this document a read. So with that, I'm going to bounce over to back to the presentation, and oops, yeah. I'm going to show the data sets, as Shelby said, for our visual learners, which includes me for sure. So let's look at this picture for a second. If you haven't seen it, it shows the 4 data sets that I just talked about: provider, client, treatment episode, and service event. It also does show some claims. We're not going to talk about them too much today unless asked. We can talk about that later. That's essentially the result of the 837. But that doesn't go directly to the warehouse. They get here through WITS after claims are paid. So we're going to focus on these the green, the red, and the orange, but I'm going to spend a second and just show you the provider. And this is what's set up in WITS already and does, like I said, make its way to the warehouse. So there will be records in here that came from WITS that allow DMH to, you know, sort of see all their providers and some basic information about each one. The arrows represent the linking, the dependencies I was talking about. So you see the clients, they want to be connected to providers. The treatment episodes, they want to be connected to the clients. And technically the provider, but ultimately it's really just the client. The treatment episode, I just said, the service events, they want to be connected actually to this piece of the model. So we'll walk through the different models in a little bit more detail in the next few minutes. The main point of this slide right now is that there are a couple different data sets and they link together. So just keep track where I am. So I want to go into the client a little bit and show you a couple examples. So once the providers are set up, it'll be required to send who your patients are, right? Who are the clients at your agency? So as you just saw, there's a sort of a relatively small model for that. Most of the information is in this top entity. There's a little bit of repeating information where you could potentially have multiple addresses or multiple identifiers. Don't worry too much about that. The only point, if you haven't read it yet, I do want you to realize is that the document is structured to reflect the levels. And the levels are actually exactly the XML levels as well. So in other words, section 1.3.1 talks all about this box. This section talks about this box, and this section talks about this box. So I'm going to flash one more picture for you. This is just to show you the whole client. The whole client's relatively simple. It's essentially their name, birth date, and a couple of these demographic fields. The orange ones go onto the federal system to TEDS. And then here's the address and the identifiers. The identifiers is, I think currently only social security number is an identifier, but it's kind of a more flexible concept for the future. If there are other identifiers, we wouldn't necessarily add a field. We'd keep the interface the same and just add a new type. So that's the client. If you prefer pictures, we're going to go back to the Word document and just look at a couple fields. So, and again, you'll have a chance to walk through this more, ask questions more in the technical meeting. I'm trying to just introduce it so the next time you see it, it's not the first time. So here's a field called the birth date. It's pretty obvious what it is. There's the field name and the description. That's literally the field name in the XML with a space. It tells you it's a date, and it tells you a couple of rules, those field level rules I talked about that apply to this birthday, such as it's required. And that's the message you'll get if you leave it blank, right? If you send a future date, you'll get this message. And if you send a really weird date, like kind of old, or you will get this message. And some of this X and Y stuff, that's really just more for DMH. They have the ability to tweak some of that on the fly in the portal. They've set the values to 10 and 100 as sort of their reasonable boundaries. So that shows you an example of a couple of fields. I want to move on, and we tried to structure this so that it's fairly clear from the names, and they're kind of self-explanatory in the naming. And I think you can see that as you stared at this picture, you probably didn't really question what anything was, and that part of that comes from just the naming convention. If you do have questions, there's a longer description in here. I want to talk for a second about coded fields. So fields like the gender or sex here, the sexual orientation, which you may not have, that's a new field, but it's optional, or these ethnicity, veteran status, anything that ends with code, basically, you're going to see kind of a special rule type. It's not a configurable error or warning. It's something that always must be true. The code that you send in for that field must be in a list somewhere. And this is telling you kind of the type of that list. And we can talk more about that as you have your questions, but just to kind of show you an example in the, presentation, we put kind of a snippet of what we call the vocabulary. So it's a fairly sophisticated thing in the back end, but you can just think of it like a list, and you have to have your, for each of these fields that it told you, you have to provide this type of code. And we can talk more about that. But those codes, you will get an error if you don't send one of those codes. So that's what we mean by the vocabulary. And you can see the colors here are just highlighting 4 different sort of field types, or we call them value sets. And that's what's being talked about here when it says vocabulary validation. Okay, so one more thing on client before we leave that. So we talked about field level rules, we talked about vocabulary. If you think back when I talked about things that are cross field, or sometimes I said cross entity, like what if you wanted to require an address, right? Where would you put that rule? Not really a rule of the address. It's not really a client field rule. That's what these additional rules are for. So sometimes at the upper level, like client, you may see it reaching down and saying, you have to send us an identifier of that type and an address, at least one address. So there's a couple of those. You'll see more of those in the treatment episode. I think these are literally the only 2 for client. But all of the documents work the same way. They come with a diagram, and then there's a sort of a section per entity with field level rules and warnings, and those additional rules that reach across. So that's really all I wanted to show you on client. Hopefully if you have any questions, we'll hear them in a little bit. I'm going to attempt to do the same thing for treatment episode, but I'm just going to point out a couple of things, so I don't want to give you too much information today. But here's the same file for the treatment episode, which really encapsulates, as Shelby said on that slide, the idea is encapsulates a lot of what you're sending currently. If you are sending, I know some of you are not, but some providers are sending to the CDR on flat files. I think it's an A file for substance use, D for mental health, and I for IDD. This is a way to sort of send me all of that, right? Let's group it into treatment episodes, and let's have admissions that can sort of have a type. It's called a program area, which would point out, is this substance use or mental health? So the definitions of some of these things are listed in here. For example, the treatment episode represents a client's episode of care at a particular provider from the time the client's initially admitted to the time they're discharged. And during that time, you might be transferred from one level of care to another. So ideally, if your system can handle it, we would like the treatment episode to be, uniquely identified. And if a client really is moving from level of care to level of care, I think ideally that would be 2 or 3 admissions within the treatment episode, right? Substance use or mental health. Nothing enforces that, however. So if you don't have a treatment episode, things would work if you needed to use your admission as your treatment episode. But the model is trying to state, we're trying to encapsulate what a treatment episode really is. And if you're transferring that, those are sort of pieces of that treatment episode. Then the discharge, would sort of close out each admission in that program area and level of care, or if it's mental health, in that setting. And some of that stuff that I'm talking about is defined up here. So I'm not going to read it to you, but here's sort of the DMH definition of what they're calling an admission. It's kind of an example here, and similar for discharge. And I didn't point out functional assessment, but it's here. I do want to spend a second on this performance outcome measure, though, an idea of what that is talking about. Shelby, let me know if you're trying to get me, if you want to talk about questions, or if we'll do that at the end as what I understood.
We can do it at the end.
Okay. So the performance outcome measure is essentially the questions that you ask when they're admitted and the questions that you ask when they're discharged. right? So there's a similar definition here and up above, actually. It kind of refers to it as a periodic assessment during the course of treatment. And that's the information that the state's going to use, number one, to report to TEDS, were they employed, all the data you've been sending, just in a slightly different format with, upgraded error handling and that type of stuff. But they'll be able to compare it over the course of treatment. So from admission to discharge, for example, or actually multiple times, if you can handle it, especially in a mental health environment, within that treatment episode, the system actually allows you to send the initial outcome measure right when they were admitted, right? And now if they're still in treatment and it's 6 months later or whatever the schedule is, the model is just saying, I can actually take those questions again as a separate record tied to that admission. I'm not discharged yet, but I'm just letting you know, I took a look and here's the updated values. So the system is actually designed to hold the initial values and the subsequent update values, which is something that the federal government wants. We realize you may not all have that built into your system right now, but that's why it's structured that way. And I think just a couple more examples about treatment episode. I'm trying to watch my time here. Is I want to say that depending on the type of admission, basically, will drive what's required. So for example, if it's a substance use admission, you'll see, let me back up. There's a few things that are always required. So an admission needs to always have an outcome measure. So you'll see that rule, where did it go? That rule will be right here as an additional rule of the admission, right? So you can't just tell me you admitted somebody, you've got to tell me, what the answers were. So that's what that rule is. That's always required. Now, what's in that outcome measure is sort of dependent on what kind of admission it is, right? Is it a substance use admission? Is it mental health? So that kind of thing, to use the picture, I will use the substance example. You have to send at least one of these if it's an outcome measure related to a substance use admission. But that type of rule you would see right here to say, for that outcome measure, if you're using me to satisfy a substance use admission, then, please don't forget to tell me about your substances, right? So there's a few things that work like that. Another example of that is in the admission itself. So most of the data is in the performance outcome measure, but there's a little bit at the admission level, such as the level of care. So there's actually a conditional rule at the admission that says you have to give me the ASAM level of care. Well, you have to give me a record actually that has the ASAM level of care value here if you're substance use. So that's another example right here where you only need to send this value for substance use. If it's mental health, you have to send me this value, which is a treatment setting. So I think my goal is not to teach you all the values. My goal is to hope that I'm doing a good job explaining the structure and that you'll be able to understand these levels and ask intelligent questions and we can talk about it. So the last one, actually, yeah, there was just one more. At the POM level for mental health, there's a rule that says, so, okay, before I do the actual rules, all these words here, all these section numbers, it follows the box approach that you can see here where there's boxes, right? But the performance outcome measure itself is kind of subdivided into, to keep it a little more manageable when we talk, there's a section about financial questions. There's a section about general health, education. We talked about the substance a little bit. Here's a section that would only apply to mental health. So again, the document's structured that way. And this mental health field, it's talking about the SMI-SED code, right? Serious mental illness, or the GAF score. That whole section, it's in the POM, but it's only required here. You only need to send that if it's mental health. So hopefully I made my point there, and hopefully that will help you read this. And to finish up treatment episode, I'm going to show you in the diagram here, there's one more example. I think I didn't specifically look at these, but it works the same way. So the vocabulary works the same way for treatment episodes. And so if you follow that, if you submit this data, then everybody's happy. DMH gets what they want, and they'll be able to do their TEDS reporting for their WITS providers and for their, for all of you with your own EHRs. Actually, before I do that, so the final data set is a service event. Let me click on it. Service event's very small. It's similar to your S files, and it's really only one box, one entity. We talked about the connection already. So it does, first of all, the definition of a service event represents a specific treatment encounter for a client with substance abuse or mental health disorders, I guess, in a provider site. So this is where you'll need to reference the admission, actually. So you'll see some fields, and we can talk about this more in detail, but we're trying to hook it up to an admission. So this may be a topic more for the technical call, but just business-wise, a service event would fall underneath of, when someone's admitted for a level of care. So that's the structure, but otherwise, I'm not going to read these too much, but the main thing to know would be a service event has to have a date that meets certain rules and a service code that's in the vocabulary. So hopefully relatively straightforward. If you have questions, we'd love to help you with them, talk them through. And I just wanted to wrap up my part with one more slide. It gets into the technical a little bit, but we wanted to tell you, without drilling into details, sort of the reasons, and you can say you've seen it, reasons XML was chosen roughly. So first of all, XML stands for Extensible Markup Language, which is really just this sort of tag syntax. And you can probably follow this, even if you're a clinician on the phone, it's just the structure of the data, right? And they're in these human readable sort of formats that support these levels that we just talked about. So it's kind of exactly what you think it is. Here's a file for a data set with a list of episodes. Here's one of them. This one has these properties or elements with these values that are in black here. And in addition, here's the sort of the structured data underneath. Within that episode, I had this admission, which had these properties, and the outcome measure. It got cut off, but that's just one example. We'll follow up with in the technical call with walking through some more. But XML is an industry standard approach to transferring this kind of information. And one big advantage, other than being very flexible and human readable, is that it's validatable before you even submit the file. So when you're doing your development, and your vendors will know all of this, they'll test out to make sure that their extract that they build adheres to this sort of high-level structure. So, before even checking if they're valid codes or if the birth date is future or any of that other stuff you saw, there's a general check that XML can perform in very quickly. So we're excited about it. There's a lot more to talk about. I don't want to dump too much more on you, but hopefully I gave you an overview and gives you enough to have a foundation. We're here to help. So James Brockman will be helping in the onboarding, and we'll pull different people in as needed, and we're happy to be here. So thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. Do you want to?
Sure.
Okay, so next we are going to do an overview of the portal screen. We have Andrew in here. He is our lead developer. And in that portal screen, you will be able to do a direct upload of those data set files and get the error reporting there. So that is what he's planning on showing you. A formal in-depth training for the providers is currently scheduled for February 19th right now. So this one is just going to be a high-level overview so that you can kind of see the interface and what's to come. But there will be much more detailed training coming soon. So Andrew, if you want to share your screen and take us through, that would be great.
All right.
Oh, I think I have to stop,
Yeah,
Andrew. Yep.
you do
Okay.
have to stop. Yeah.
Here we go.
Well, hello everybody. I'm Andrew, as we just mentioned. I'm going to share my screen here and take you through the submission portal. I can't tell if everybody can see my screen.
I can.
Yeah.
Okay.
I see the email in the back, Andrew.
Oh,
Maybe
there's
if
an
you
email
just
in the back.
maximize.
Yeah, there we go.
There you go.
All
I
right.
think that's probably better.
All right. Well, so this is the direct submission portal here. When you first enter, you'd be presented with the screen and the disclaimer. And once you click OK, you can enter your username or your email address and password to log in. So we'll go ahead and log in here. Sure, DMH will be providing, or we will be providing everybody's usernames and passwords or configuring people. So as a submitting entity, when we first log in, we see the submission portal and all of the jobs listed here. So in this case, I'm logged in as a submitting entity that has submitted many different jobs or files. And we can go through here and see the list of jobs that I've submitted or that have been submitted by my organization. So this is the user I'm logged in as. But you can see you can see that other submissions by other users within my organization have submitted files as well, and I can see those. I'm going to move into a specific example here. You can see it here now, but I can also search for a specific file to see all of the instances. In this case, I'm searching on the file name. And this kind of illustrates that while the files do have to adhere to a naming convention, which is described in the submission guide that Ryan has gone through, but I don't know that he touched on the exact file name convention, but it's in there. It doesn't have to be unique. So you can see this file has actually been submitted multiple times. And then as we move across, we can see more information about it when it was submitted. The number of successful records and the number of errors and warnings. In this case, there were none. The status here will indicate the processing status of it. As it gets first initially submitted, it would be in the initialized state. And then the ellipse menu over here would allow me to view details or download an Excel or PDF of the errors that came back. So in this case, I'm actually going to go through and upload this file again for us. So when we click the upload, we have the option of dropping a file right onto the screen or going through and browsing to it. I'm going to go ahead and drop the file here. And then we can see that the file's here, but it has not been uploaded yet. So we'll hit upload, we'll see the progress go, and then once it's complete, we can hit done. All right, since it's such a small file, it instantaneously went to complete status, so I didn't even get to see it go through the initialized. But so here we are, and we see we have 2 errors on it. And I can click on the file name to go into the details about the file. When files are uploaded, they go through several steps. The data access validation, this is the data set access. This will be configured by DMH, so we shouldn't see any errors here. Everybody should know what data sets they can upload. The schema validation, that's the piece that Ryan was talking to just before we came into this part, that these XML files will be validated against the XSD schema, and just to make sure that it's in the format we're expecting. If an error occurs here, the processing will stop, and it will need to be corrected and re-uploaded before. Post-processing step here collects some other statistics about the job after it was run. So we shouldn't see any errors here, but this is just one of the steps that we have. So down here we can see, the count of the errors that we had. And then we can see a description about each error. In this case, this particular file has a birth date that is in the future. So we can see that here. We can see the source record identifier. So this is the primary key or the identifier from the source system. This is how we know when you submit a record that it is the same record in our system when you submit it again. So we know whether to update or create a new record from it. And in this case, we can also see the provider source record identifier as well. So we could go back, and I've actually made a correction to this. Actually made a correction to this file. So I went into this XML file and I went and updated the date of birth to be 2000 instead of 2001. If this were in real life, I would go into my source system, I'd make that correction there, I'd reproduce my file, and then I'd go and upload it to make sure the correction is in the source system as well. So we can go back through the upload here and we can move in the corrected one. So go through a similar process. We can see that it's here. We had 6 successful records. Those are the client's records and all of its sub records, the addresses and identifiers for the client. And we can go in here and we see we have no errors for this. I guess that wraps up the submission portion of this. Did we have other pieces we wanted to cover, Ryan? Or
that's good
Shelby?
For now. We'll do more details on the 19th when we go through it, but this was a good preview. Thank you.
All right.
Looks like you'll have a question brewing to answer, Andrew, so hang around.
All right. I'll stop sharing and we can go back.
Thanks, Andrew. Ryan, are you going to share again?
Oh, sure, yes, I forgot about that. Sorry about that. So, all right, so I'll let you talk, Shelby.
Perfect. All right, you can move on to the next slide. Okay, so here is our rollout plan. We had a kickoff webinar November 6th. We're doing the system overview right now, January 29th. We had mentioned a technical webinar for those XML schemas. That will be for vendors. Providers, you're more than welcome to join, but it might sound like a different language to you. That is scheduled for February 5th. We also have bi-weekly technical assistance webinars. That will be for both providers and vendors, and that is scheduled every 2 weeks starting February 12th. And then the webinar training for admin portal and the XML data, so that will be more detail from what Andrew just showed us, and that is for February 18th. I did see a question. Somebody asked what time those will be. I believe they are at either 9 or 10. I will look that up and then answer it during our Q&A time. Ryan, Lisa said 10. So those will start at 10. They'll vary in length based on the meeting. But Ryan, if you want to go ahead.
Advance.
Yep. Okay. And so these are not specific meetings necessarily. These are activities that will take place. And so the XML schema testing can start February 5th after we do that XML webinar. The submitting entities, which will be all you providers with your own systems, will be able to test data in our production environment with your UAT data, so not real data, but you can start testing that March 1st, and that will go through June 31st. Take a break, and then you can resume testing after August 1st if your system's not ready by then. DMH will validate the data set testing as you start submitting and start testing. And then our production environment will be copied to the UAT environment, and production will be cleared so that you can start submitting real data. The plan right now is to start submitting on August 1st using July's data. And this is the part DMH really wanted to send home. If your EHR is not ready to submit to the data warehouse by July 31st, you will have to do that double data entry into WITS and your own system until your system is ready. That way they can accurately do their tenth reporting. There's one question that, will everyone on the call receive invites to the various meetings? And the answer to that is yes. Ryan, you can go ahead.
All right.
Okay, so for our next steps, DMH has this website, and they will be posting support documentation and webinars there. Providers and vendors, your next steps are to attend the applicable webinars and start testing. And then DMH sent out a survey on the 21st. If you have not completed that yet, we will need you to do that. Okay.
All right.
Now time for questions. Okay.
I see that there was a question that came up during my part. This is Andrew again, by the way. If there's an error on a submission, do we need to send the whole file over again or just the errors? This was actually asked twice, was it? Or just repeated so it didn't get lost? So that question depends. If the error prevented the record from being created, then we would need the entire, okay, first of all, in my case, my file was just one record, but yeah, you would only need to send the records that failed. And if they failed, I can.
Yep.
Okay. I wanted to give you a little background on what happens today. We have a 5%. If they submit a file that has 5% errors, they have to send the whole file again, and that may be what this is in reference to. Is on the errors. We're not going to have an error threshold on the WITS data warehouse submission. Mm-hmm. So right. It will take the good records. And Ryan, you remember this, so you could speak better to this.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. I do have the original manual open, and yeah, we don't have that, I guess, restriction. So if a record, like Andrew was probably about to say, if you have a file with several records, 100 records, and 80 of them pass and 20 of them don't, the 80 of them got in, the 20 did not. So technically, you could, when you figure out what the errors are and you fix them, you can just send what changed, or you can send all of them again. But at no point will we bomb out and sort of stop the whole thing. It's because it's record by record, we kind of didn't need that.
Right.
Good question, though. Thanks, Denise and Andrew. Shelby, I'm not able to see the questions, so I think we'll rely on you to sort of relay them if there are others right now.
Okay, so the first one that came through, we were talking about the addresses, and there was a question, what if your client is homeless? Do we send the agency address or something similar?
Gotcha. I'll have to punt that to DMH as a policy decision. I don't remember if we spell it out in here. I don't think that we do. So as of right now, yeah, there would have to be something sent to satisfy it. So you could.
I wrote that down to follow up on. This is Denise.
Okay.
Hey Denise, this is Kate, and I'm just saying this out loud, but this, totally your call. A lot of times in other instances, if there's a homeless situation, they'll use that agency wherever the treatment's happening. They'll use that address.
Cool. Thanks, Kate.
Okay.
Your call, though. Just putting it out there.
I don't think that's what we do, but I'll follow up with the answer.
Okay.
The next question was, what is the definition of a treatment episode for IDD?
So,
Okay, this is Denise again. Kim, are you on the line? Just if I misstate, please correct me. For the IDDs will be put in a program, IDD residential or IDD outpatient. That will be considered an episode. It's part of the WITS training that we're doing. If you can take one of the client level WITS entry training, that would probably help explain that to you.
Okay. And then the next one was about the submission errors. So the one after that was, what is an example of mental health performance measure?
oh, sure. Yeah, I can probably take that one, unless Denise would rather. I can get you close anyway. So an example of a mental health thing that occurs to me would be, or a outcome measure that occurs to me would be your SMI or SED value, serious emotional disturbance or mental illness, or your GAF score. Those are some of the examples. I don't actually think there's too many others. I think there may be one other here about your legal status. And right now that's only required in certain settings. So there's not too much, Denise, unless you want to correct me if I'm wrong. Those are the only mental health ones that occur to me.
Okay. So the next one, would there be a time limit to resubmit the error file in the data warehouse? Say if we submitted a file for January, didn't fix errors until February, could we still submit the error file?
Gotcha.
Can we talk a minute about the time? Are we on the question about the 837? I'm sorry, I may have jumped ahead.
No, it was the one from Sharon Wright. It's
Okay.
before the 837.
So I can answer the technical part of that, Denise, if you want. There's no system limit to when you can resubmit, but I know that you have some policy language that you'd prefer to get, last month's data submitted, by a certain date.
Well, I think you have it documented in your submission guides. The 837 has to be processed prior to the data warehouse if they're submitting an 837.
Yep.
And the date of the data warehouse submission, we're looking at the 20th like we currently have. So if you start falling behind, you get paid on your 837s for those that are grant funded.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't
Right.
get paid.
Right. Right. So as long as you're following the, oh, okay. Right. So I was just going to say that dependency-wise, you do have to follow sort of as I was talking about earlier, provider, client, treatment episode, service event, as far as to the warehouse. But yeah, then there is sort of the 837 piece that'll be going to WITS, getting adjudicated, and coming to the warehouse. Right. And so the service events, in order for that to work properly, the service events have to go to the warehouse. So was there a question about that as well, you said? I know we only have 2 minutes scheduled.
There's a situation that when we get behind a month with data submissions, they submit quarterly reports. I have to have data submitted like for December by Friday. And I know that I don't have all the data yet, but we can't leave the window open into February because they do quarterly reporting already. And we're already behind. So they give us till the end of the month for us to submit to the feds. So if we don't pick up their data, we won't have their data to submit to TEDS.
Gotcha. Okay.
There's a couple more questions. One, does this replace our EHR system that our company uses now? Denise answered that WITS is an option to use for an EHR, which is true. We just would need to provide login credentials for you. but this is, the data warehouse is not a replacement for your EHR. It's, you would submit your data from your EHR so that DMH could get that data. The question was about the 837, and it says, so we'll be submitting an XML file, which will include service information, and also an 837P file for billable services. Is that correct? And the 837 will be submitted in WITS, and the XML files will be submitted within the data warehouse portal. So there's two different systems that you'll be logging.
Yeah, that's totally accurate.
And then the last one, with our 1 minute left, do we enter every session that our providers have with our clients into, like we do in our system that we use? My company uses ClaimTrack. And so I think for that one, you're asking if you enter into WITS, and the answer, if you have your own EHR, you wouldn't need to enter into WITS unless your company can't generate these XML files in ClaimTrack. So you would still use your own EHR, and then your EHR would generate those XML files, and then you would take those files and upload them to the data warehouse.
Great. Are there a lot more questions, Shelby?
There's just one more, and I actually think this is a good one. Will the initial submission files have to be built from scratch using the manuals, or is there any XML template files to help us in the initial builds?
Gotcha. Yeah, so one of the things that DMH will be posting soon, Denise, I'm not sure if you did already or not, but we can send you the two things: the template files that are technically the XSD, the schema definition files. That'll jumpstart your programming team, and they can talk more about that in the technical webinar. And also we have a handful of sample files, you know, sort of the final product, what they need to look like. So those two things together should help, and the technical webinars should help you get those going.
All righty. If there are any more questions that we didn't get to, you can go ahead and send them to that EHR help desk at dmh.ms.gov. If there's something that they can't answer, they will forward it to the FEI team. Like I said, this has been recorded, and so we'll get that posted, as well as the submission guides and all the XML resources.
Okay, the submission guides are on the website, but not the XML samples.
Okay, cool. And then I will go ahead and respond to this meeting invite and send out this presentation to everybody as well, so that you have it on hand.
Great. Well, thank you all.
All right, thank you. Have a great day.
Okay, bye-bye.